What's up, gamers? I'm the Lights, and I want to take some time today to talk about the preview of the weapon tuning coming in the mid-season update that I think could be a huge boost to a few weapons, like an insane boost to a few weapons. These changes were first featured in a TWAB from a few weeks ago, March the 30th. After the couple weeks that have passed, I've taken some time to think about how these changes are going to affect PvE primaries, and I want to share my read going into the mid-season patch so you can be the first to get the new best guns in your hands. So, in a game with so many different and interesting weapons to choose from and use, and ability to swap between them pretty freely, on top of different perk rolls and just the overall ridiculous amount of weapon diversity that we have in this game, I'm sure all of you have tried out and probably even actively used quite a few different guns with representation from many different weapon archetypes just to freshen it up. That said, though, the consensus best primary weapons in the game for years now has been submachine guns. You'd use a submachine gun all the way up until your engagement distance was so far away that the SMG was actually useless, and then you'd use either a scout rifle or whatever gun was on the artifact that season. There were, however, a few guns from a few different archetypes that were able to rise up and retain a competitive position despite the shortcomings of an archetype that was, not an SMG. For example, let's look at the BXR. It's a gun that everyone universally loves as far as I'm aware, and it's a pulse rifle. Pulse rifles are just not optimal. This is due to their GPS just being considerably lower than SMGs currently, to the point where their range advantage just isn't worth the trade-off. Despite this, people like the BXR anyway, and it remains a favorite and a competitive option for its extra usability, insanely potent perk rolls like Demo with Incandescent. There are quite a few weapons that fall into this category of sort of transcending their weapon type, but first I want to break down the advantages and disadvantages of each weapon type that is inherent with the weapon type itself, and my understanding of Bungie's rationale when they were designing the sandbox in this way. Weapon types are most easily ordered by their effective ranges, from bows and scouts having pretty much infinite range in practice, and SMGs and sidearms excelling in the shorter range. And the trade-off, of course, being that SMGs and sidearms do a lot more DPS than bows and scouts do within their intended engagement distances. It's a little more complicated than that, though, particularly with everything other than the four weapon types that I just mentioned. Starting with the low end of the range band, we have sidearms. Sidearm range caps out at around 20 meters with a max range roll, and a realistic PvE roll is going to cap out at more like 15. This is obviously very close, but it is made up for by the fact that sidearms do a lot of damage compared to other primaries. Another pair of advantages that sidearms have is a fairly fast reload animation and very high recoil direction. Reload animations and recoil direction play a pretty big part in how a gun feels to use. I'm sure you've probably noticed that getting 100 reload speed on like a machine gun, for example, does not feel at all the same as getting 100 reload like stat on like an SMG, for example. This is because how fast the top and bottom ends of the reload stat are is balanced from weapon type to weapon type. Recoil direction is a stat that is often straight up ignored by a lot of players, especially on mouse and keyboard, but how much easier it is to control full auto or burst weapons with high recoil direction is crazy. And investing into something like Arrowhead Break on, say, an auto rifle with poor recoil direction will make a massive difference on how the gun feels, whereas on a sidearm, an archetype with good base recoil direction, like I mentioned, it'll do next to nothing, if anything at all, since it can't really get any better. Instead, you can opt to invest into things like range, which also gives you a lot more options, since there are a lot more barrels that boost range than there are that boost recoil direction. A downside that sidearms have is another bit of secret sauce that isn't talked about so much, and that is mag size. It's easy to compare mag capacity, like the actual number between guns in the same archetype, but comparing across archetypes is a little bit harder. Sidearms don't get to spray rounds down for very long before they need to reload compared to other primaries. The total damage you get out of a magazine is relatively low, even if your DPS within that magazine is relatively high. For example, you might be doing like X amount of DPS while shooting an auto rifle, but you get to shoot it for like 20 straight seconds, whereas on a sidearm, you're doing X amount more DPS, but you only get to shoot for a few seconds. And with all these positives I outlined, like the good recoil direction, fast reload animation, and good DPS, it begs the question of why sidearms have been largely shunned in favor of SMGs. And well, SMGs and sidearms currently do about the same DPS, And that being the case, the extra few meters you get by using an SMG is just free. There were still sidearms that crept into relevance, though, the most notable of which likely being the Drang for having juiced stats for its archetype, especially in the zoom department, which if you're into the PvP sandbox at all, you'll understand how important that is. For those of you who don't know why that's important, zoom basically multiplies your range stat to get your damage fall off, and therefore increases your effective range more than the actual range stat does. It's like a multiplier. It's another bit of secret sauce, something that Bungie doesn't make super obvious, but really plays into how a gun feels. These factors made Drang an outlier in its otherwise mediocre family. Some other sidearms that punch above their class in this way are guns like Liminal Vigil from Spire of the Watcher for its ability to roll headstone in the third column. And the new Buzzard is a weapon that I haven't really used at all, but I believe could potentially be one of those outliers. Michael's Reverence from the new Root of Nightmares raid is one that's gotten quite a bit of attention lately, though I attribute that mostly to an underdeveloped sandbox of strand weapons as opposed to the gun actually being cut from the same cloth as guns like Drang. I expect Michael's to largely fall into obscurity after more options for strand weapons become available, in much the same way that Brigand's Law used to be highly praised for its ability to roll Volt Shot until an SMG that rolled with Volt Shot came around in the Ikelos and everybody forgot about Brigand's Law. At the end of the day, Drang I see as the main sidearm to look out for when these changes roll out, and then Buzzard and Liminal Vigil are also going to be guns to maybe keep an eye on. And then I guess Michael's and Brigand's Law will probably be pretty decent too. SMGs occupy the next range band out to about 20 to 25 meters, but they're not getting touched. As such, I think it's more important to talk about what guns have those distinguishing attributes that places them a cut above the rest. These are the guns that will have what it takes to stay relevant, even if everything else is brought up to parity, as is Bungie's goal. SMGs have a slower base reload animation than most primaries, have a decent magazine size, and very good recoil direction. Obviously, just about any SMG with a decent role is a contender these days, but the main ones I expect to stay in the spotlight if these changes push SMGs down a lot as a whole are guns like Unforgiven from Duality for the role of Demolitionist and Frenzy, which is the strongest perk roll for a primary weapon in the game in my opinion. The Funnel Web for its juiced base stats, the Callus Mini Tool for being craftable and having incandescent as well as great third column perk options for pairing with solar subclasses. Honorable mention to Out of Bounds, pretty much purely for its ability to roll Demolitionist in the third column with damage perks like Adrenaline Junkie and Golden Tricorn. Demolitionist in the third column is going to be somewhat of a trend in this video. It's just insanely strong to be able to get Demolitionist with a range or with a damage perk on primary weapons. There's also the Immortal, which is likely the biggest non-exotic statistical anomaly in the game and the PvP meta as of the making of this video. However, like Michael's Reverence that we talked about, I feel pretty confident that Immortal's current praise and wide usage in PvE is entirely due to a lack of competition in its niche as a strand primary. I don't think the roles of Threat Detector with Demolitionist or Hatchling in the fourth column should really be getting anyone too excited once some other strand primaries take the spotlight, and I foresee it being relegated to the Crucible only when that time comes. And finally, of course, the Ikelos SMG for its great roll options and insanely juiced stats bested only by the Immortal. And the Ikelos SMG was a gun that was loaded with secret sauce prior to Bungie removing what was apparently a full stack Zen moment like stability bonus to the gun that was just hidden away in there. And this is exactly the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. Like some guns just get this special treatment from Bungie and end up insane. But even with all that stuff gone, Ikelos still gets Volt Shot, still gets Frenzy, still gets Perpetual Motion, still gets Threat. It's a good gun. We extend our range out a little bit further. We have auto rifles, which are kind of a weird case actually, because auto rifles have a lot of variance in terms of their range just based on archetype, with the two extremes of the family being the 720 RPM rapid fire autos, which I'll add most people tend to feel the best right now, but their effective range can only get up to about 30 meters with a max range roll, and then they'll realistically be about 25 on a PvE roll. But then on the flip side, we have 360 RPM high impact frame auto rifles, literally half the RPM, and on those a PvE roll can reach out all the way to around 35 meters, maybe even 40 meters. 600s and 450s of course fall in the middle, and auto rifles as a whole have a fast intrinsic reload animation a large intrinsic mag size, so they're already good in terms of uptime, but currently lack a lot of damage, falling very far behind SMGs and sidearms in terms of DPS currently for the meager range increase, which is why they're seeing the biggest buff, I think. Another curious downside that auto rifles have is generally very poor recoil direction, warranting the use of barrels like arrowhead break. In the current sandbox, I think auto rifles were likely the worst overall primary weapon archetype, aligning with, like I said, them getting the biggest buff. They're going to be the only primary weapon getting a 25% damage buff from the mid-season patch. Just like the other archetypes, though, there were still some auto rifles that were competitive anyway. Sweet Sorrow from Season 16 for its role of stats for all, one for all, and being craftable. Gnawing Hunger for reasons I honestly can't explain. The Amit for being craftable and having Incandescent to pair with Ambitious Assassin. And I think most relevantly, Rufus's Fury for being Strand and rolling with Demolitionist and Frenzy together. Rufus's Fury I forecast as being the best Strand primary in the game following the changes. This gun is not a pretender that is taking advantage of an underdeveloped Strand weapon arsenal the way that the Immortal is and the way that Michael's Reverence is. I think Rufus's Fury is going to be a standout following these changes, and it's already showing a little bit of that potential. With all this in mind, I mean, it should go without saying, but auto rifles being the recipients of the largest buff from this pass are the number one weapon type I'll be keeping my eye on. Now we have hand cannons, which are a favorite weapon type of a lot of people, myself included, but have really not been a good choice in PvE for a while, but do get occasional artifact representation, and again, have some guns that break free from their suboptimal weapon type. Hand cannons cap out at around 40 meters of range with a max range roll, just like auto rifles, but an average PvE roll will outrange an average auto by about 5 meters, usually reaching out to around 30. Hand cannons have fairly slow reload animations, very good recoil direction, and fairly low magazine size. This seems like quite a bit of downsides, and hand cannons are a bit of an interesting point because damage breakpoints matter on hand cannons more than any other weapon type because their per shot damage is so high. This is of course compensated for by the slowest average RPM, aside from bows. But a ton of hand cannons become usable in content where a single hand cannon headshot downs an ad. In that same vein, as soon as that ad doesn't die in one shot, the ad now takes twice as long to kill. It takes twice as many rounds out of your magazine to kill. And even if the one shot did 99% of its health, you still need to shoot it again. This sounds kind of silly, but if you compare this to higher RPM weapons like autos and subs especially, like let's say you have an ad in an activity and the hand cannon one-shots it. Submachine gun might kill it in like 5 shots, let's say. Now let's add a couple levels to the encounter to the point where the hand cannon now leaves the ad at like 90% health. The amount of shots the hand cannon needs to do doubles. The SMG only needs to shoot 1 extra shot to do enough damage, which in this example is only 20% more shots in the case of the SMG. I think this is something that makes sense to many of you intuitively before the explanation, and this is an oversimplification of it, but it's so incredibly relevant because of how much more important the damage of individual hand cannon shots is to the weapon's place in the meta. My guess is that this buff extends the range of content that hand cannons are efficient in and make them a little less terrible to use when they're on the artifact. Hand cannons, however, are the highest variance for me, and the weapon type that I'm the least sure about. I wouldn't be surprised if the buffs end up literally not being felt at all, and I wouldn't be surprised if they slingshot all the way to being the best PvE primaries in the game, like no joke. To list a few hand cannons that were good, even when hand cannons weren't so good, we have Posterity for Deepstone from Deepstone Crypt, which gets Frenzy with Volt Shot, which is a ridiculously good roll. If we see that on any gun ever again, it's going to be an instant contender as well. We've also got Zauli's Bane for the role of Incandescent and Explosive Payload, a very rare case where selecting Incandescent doesn't forfeit an actual bullet damage perk. It's also a craftable gun. And the one that I'm most excited for is Fatebringer for its role of Explosive Payload and Frenzy. This perk roll is essentially 2 damage perks with permanent or near permanent uptime, and you don't even lose anything for it since Frenzy basically just doubles as a reload perk. This amount of boost to your bullet damage at this high of uptime is really rare in this game, and this roll could stretch the effects of the balance change a ton to the point where, like, who knows, maybe we'll all be 3 or 4 tapping ads and GMs with this Fatebringer roll once the patch hits. Or then again, of course, it could not really matter. At any rate, keep an eye on Fatebringer. I'm definitely not biased. It's definitely not my favorite gun in the game. Pulse rifles usually are going to hit out to around 35, 40 meters, depending on the archetype, and cap out at around 45. Pulses and everything else that we've mentioned so far really fall into a weird spot in a game like Destiny where it's generally pretty easy and most importantly quick to change to a more favorable engagement distance, allowing you to use a gun that just does more damage but has less range, like an SMG. Pulse rifles have pretty average magazine size and base reload animations compared to the other primaries, and typically have poor recoil direction, which again highly incentivizes corrections from things like arrowhead break, which means losing out on a tiny bit of potential range. There's a bit of a weird case with pulses, though, where the list of pulse rifles that broke free of their poor-performing family actually includes an entire archetype, which is the 450 RPM aggressive frame 4-burst pulses, which are Insidious, Disparity, Sacred Provenance, and Velis X. These guns honestly do pretty darn good damage right now, and I think they're already quite good, not just usable. Outside of those, though, there's of course the BXR that I talked about a little bit in the intro, Smite of Moraine from Kingsfall for its ability to roll Demolitionist or Focused Fury in the first column and being craftable. I also want to quickly mention Revision 0, which is getting a 75% boost to its 2-burst mode and a 25% boost to its sniper mode, which already did as much damage as a 72 RPM sniper. It works with 4 times the charm, so you get 6 consecutive sniper shots, assuming you don't miss. It gets the 20% damage boost from Vorpal, since it's technically a primary. And it's going to be getting this 20% pulse rifle buff on top of that. And honestly, I already thought Revision 0 was pretty good, so this thing might be a little bonkers. Yeah, I don't want to talk about exotics too much in this video just because they're really difficult to compare to other exotics from other classes. Obviously, stuff like Sunshot is going to be bananas with the hand cannon buff, and Traveler's Chosen's probably going to be pretty good. Trespasser's probably going to be pretty good. You know, stuff like that. Like they're gonna get better, but they're difficult to compare to each other. Second to last here, we have scout rifles, which, to be honest, I actually don't think need a buff. Bungie acknowledged this to an extent in the post, stating that they want to be careful not to overbuff scouts in particular because of their insane range. I think the community's general sentiment on scout rifles is a symptom of what I was talking about earlier, and that is that it is just so easy to close some distance in this game, generally speaking, and instead use a gun that just does more damage. But if we're talking strictly about the guns themselves here, I not only think scouts don't need a buff, but I think that their existence as they are currently actually prevents other primaries from carving out a niche. As I was writing this, I realized I actually have quite a lot to say about scout rifles, to the point that my thoughts could definitely fill an entire, hopefully compelling video. So if you want to see that, leave a comment. But TLDR, scouts have a ton of range. So much so that if scouts are the upper limit of primary weapon range, everything that isn't a scout rifle are fighting amongst themselves for just 40% of the primary weapon range band. This is why scouts are kind of a problem. If you usually run an SMG and you find yourself wanting more range in an activity, you don't throw on a hand cannon for an extra 10 meters. Well, you might for fun, but realistically, you throw on a scout for an extra 70 meters. Scouts do come with some usability drawbacks, like their high zoom being a little unwieldy and more common engagement distances sometimes. They typically have very poor recoil direction. But with scouts' poor recoil direction incentivizing correction from arrowhead break and other recoil direction barrels, it's not even a downside in this case, because what you're missing out on by going for those types of barrels is range. And the lowest range scout rifle in the game is hitting at 87 meters. Like, what's the big deal if you're missing out on 10 range? They also have quite good base reload animation, quite good mag size, so that's pretty much why I don't think they need a buff. But they are getting better, by 10% to be exact, and to keep with the theme, I really like Trusty with Rapid Hit Incandescent. I really like Tarnished Metal with Demolitionist and Volt Shot or Explosive Payload. I really like Doom of Chelchis with Explosive Payload and Frenzy. I like Long Arm with Subsistence Dragonfly, but again, like scouts are pretty good. Pretty much anything with explosive payload definitely going to work for you. That leads us into bows, which I'm only going to mention briefly because they aren't getting touched, but bows are really interesting because they have the same kind of weird property that hand cannons do, where their slow rate of fire leads them to relying on hitting breakpoints and also have the same weird property that scouts do, but even more so since bows don't have damage fall off. The innately different way that a bow operates compared to the other primaries makes it a little apples to oranges, really, but I already felt like they were strong, so I agree with Bungie that they don't need to be buffed. If the aggregate usefulness of the weapon type falls beneath others after this patch, though, I don't really think any particular bow will stand out and rise above all the others, since the best roll any bow can get is pretty much just Archer's Tempo and a consistent damage perk like Explosive Head or Frenzy. And pretty much every bow in the game gets a roll like that, so yeah, it's kind of a nothing burger. But yeah, that's it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that video, enjoyed hearing me rant. I'm excited for the patch. Should be fun. If you want to see what guns I'm using after the patch hits, make sure you subscribe, turn on the bell, all that jazz. Leave a like, leave a comment. Deuces.